She saved a wounded man she found bleeding in the dust. The very next day, his entire tribe of warriors surrounded her house, ready for war. But that's not even the craziest part of this story. Not by a long shot. The sun in that part of the territory doesn't just shine, it judges. It beats down on the baked earth until the dust itself feels like tiny shards of glass in your lungs. Clara McKee knew that feeling better than anyone. It was the taste of being alone, the taste of survival. She was hauling a half-empty bucket from the creek, a mile-long walk she made twice a day, when she saw it. At first she figured it was just another casualty of the heat. A coyote, maybe. Or a deer the buzzards had gotten to. But then she saw the faintest movement. A chest, rising and falling, so shallow it was almost invisible. Her heart didn't just beat, it slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She crept closer, her worn-out boots making no sound on the parched ground. He was young, barely a man. His skin was the color of copper, left out in a storm. His black hair was matted to his forehead, with sweat, dirt, and a whole lot of blood. And sticking out of his thigh was the snapped-off shaft of an arrow. Her father's voice, a ghost she hadn't heard in years, whispered in her ear. "You see one of them alone, girl? He's bait. The rest ain't far." Her father had been a hard man, but he hadn't been a stupid one. Every instinct she had screamed at her to turn around, to forget what she saw, to just walk away and let the desert claim him. But her feet were frozen to the spot. She knelt down, the water in her bucket sloshing, and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. A pulse, faint, fluttering, but it was there. He was alive. As she shifted his head, a low groan escaped his cracked lips. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap. A sound of pure, helpless pain. Without thinking, she dipped her fingers in the precious water she'd walked so far for and let the drops fall onto his mouth. He flinched, then his throat worked, swallowing. His eyes fluttered open for just a second. They were dark, deep, and filled with a kind of fire she'd never seen before. He mumbled something, a word that wasn't English or Spanish. It sounded like a prayer, or maybe it was a curse. That's when she heard the horses. It wasn't the sound of one horse, but many, their hooves thundering against the ground, coming up on her fast. She looked up, and her blood ran cold. 6 riders, their faces covered with dusty bandanas, rifles held loose and ready in their hands. And leading them was a man she knew all too well. Tucker, a man with a voice like rocks grinding together, and a soul as mean as a cornered rattlesnake. "Well now, Miss McKee," Tucker drawled, his horse dancing nervously as he reined it in. His cold eyes flicked from her to the wounded man at her feet. "Ain't this a pretty little picture?" Clara stood up slowly, every muscle in her body tense like a wire. "He's hurt, Tucker. Dying." "He's Comanche," Tucker snapped back, his voice cutting through the air. "Killed 2 of my men back at Dry Creek. Shot him in the back like a coward, then ran and left his own brothers to die." He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust just inches from her feet. "We've been tracking him for 2 days." Clara didn't move an inch. She just stood there, a human shield between them and the man on the ground. One of Tucker's men let out a rough laugh. "Let her have him, Tuck. He'll gut her in her sleep before the sun comes up tomorrow." Tucker leaned forward in his saddle, his face a mask of pure hatred. "You help him, Clara? You're no better than him. You're a traitor to your own kind. Might as well paint your face and start singing war chants." Her jaw tightened until it ached. "He's bleeding to death." "Then let him," Tucker said, his hand moving to rest on the rifle sitting across his lap. "Unless you want us to finish the job for you? Quicker that way." She stared him down, the heat of the sun forgotten, the weight of the bucket gone. All she felt was a cold, hard fury. "You raise that rifle on my land, Tucker, and I swear to God, I will put you in the ground right next to him." The world went silent. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. One of the younger riders shifted uncomfortably. "She ain't worth it, Tucker." Tucker's eyes never left hers. For a long moment, she thought he was going to do it. She thought it was all going to end right there, in a cloud of gun smoke and blood. Then he spat in the dust again. "You always were a fool for lost causes, Clara," he snarled. He yanked his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal whinnied in protest, and galloped away. His men followed, leaving nothing behind but a thick cloud of dust and the echo of their hatred. Clara stood there until the dust settled, until she was sure they were gone. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her knees felt weak, her hands were shaking, but she knelt beside the Comanche warrior again. "You better be worth it," she whispered, pulling the scarf from her own neck and pressing it against the wound on his leg. She half dragged, half carried him back to her small, lonely cabin. Every step was agony. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Her back screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She'd made her choice. Inside, she kicked aside a rug, revealing a hidden trap door to the root cellar. The cool, earthy smell that rose up felt like a blessing. "I am going to regret this," she muttered, carefully lowering him down into the darkness. She tossed a blanket, a jar of salve, and her last full canteen of water down after him before closing the heavy door. She slid the bolt into place, and only then did her legs finally give out. She slumped against the wall, her rifle across her lap, listening to the sound of her own ragged breathing. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, a man she didn't know, a man her people called an enemy, lay wounded and helpless beneath her floorboards. "I hope you live," she whispered to the empty room, "because I just bet my life on you." But what Clara didn't know was that the arrow in his leg wasn't from Tucker's men. And the man in her cellar wasn't just any warrior. He was the son of the great chief Maka, and he hadn't been running from the settlers. He'd been running from his own people. The cellar smelled of damp earth, dried herbs, and secrets. Clara worked by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, her hands shaking as she cut away the man's buckskin trousers. The arrow was lodged deep in his thigh, the area around it swollen and angry. He was burning with fever, his skin hot to the touch. She knew she had to get the arrowhead out, but she couldn't just pull it. It was barbed. It would tear him apart from the inside. She poured whiskey over the wound, and he let out a sharp, guttural cry, his body arching in pain. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. He saw a threat, an enemy. "It's all right," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just hold still." She took a deep breath, took her sharpest knife, and began to cut. It was gruesome work. She had to slice into his flesh, following the shaft of the arrow down to find the metal head. He thrashed and groaned, fighting against her, but he was too weak. She held him down with one hand and cut with the other, sweat pouring down her face, mixing with the blood on her hands. Finally, she felt the tip of the knife scrape against metal. She worked the blade around the arrowhead, loosening it from the muscle, and then, with a deep breath and a prayer, she pulled. The man screamed, a raw, terrible sound that echoed in the small space and seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin above. Then he went limp, his body slumping back onto the cot, unconscious. The arrowhead was out, but the bleeding was worse now, much worse. She worked frantically, packing the wound with herbs and wrapping it tightly with clean strips of cloth. For hours she fought to keep him alive. She bathed his feverish body with cool water and forced sips of broth between his lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in his own language. Over and over she heard the same word, whispered on a fevered breath. "Nokomi!" It sounded like a name, a woman's name, maybe a wife or a lover, waiting for him to return. The thought sent a strange pang through her chest, one she couldn't quite name. She slept in a chair by the trap door, her rifle never leaving her side. She told herself it was because she didn't trust him, but a small, honest part of her knew that wasn't the whole truth. She was protecting him, from Tucker, from the desert, from death itself. By the second morning, the fever had broken. She went down into the cellar with a bowl of stew and found him awake. His eyes were clear, and they followed her every move. He was still weak, but the wildness was gone. In its place was a quiet, watchful intelligence. He didn't speak as she handed him the bowl, but when their fingers brushed, it was like a jolt of lightning passed between them. He held her gaze, and for the first time, she didn't see an enemy. She saw a man. He ate slowly, deliberately. When he was finished, he handed the bowl back to her with both hands, a gesture of respect. Then he looked at the tightly wrapped bandage on his leg, and then back at her. "Why?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse, but the word was clear. "English." Clara was taken aback. "You speak English?" He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Some." She crossed her arms, trying to regain her composure. "You were dying, that's why." He studied her face, his dark eyes searching for something. "The others," he said. "The men with rifles. They would have killed me." "They wanted to," she admitted. "But you stopped them," he said. "It wasn't a question. You fought for me. I I don't believe in letting a man die in the dirt, no matter who he is." It was a half-truth, and they both knew it. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that made the hair on her arm stand up. "My name is Koa." She nodded. "I'm Clara." "Clara," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. He looked at her, his expression serious. "You have saved me, but you have also put yourself in great danger." Before she could ask what he meant, she heard it. The sound that had haunted her dreams for 2 nights. The sound of horses. But this wasn't like before. This wasn't the clumsy, thundering approach of Tucker's posse. This was different. It was quiet, deliberate. The sound of dozens of horses moving as one, surrounding her cabin with a silent, deadly grace. Koa's eyes widened, and for the first time Clara saw real fear in them. "They found me," he whispered. "Who?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Tucker?" He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if he could see through the floorboards to the world above. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My father, the tribe, they are not here to save me." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "They are here to kill me." The world outside her window had transformed. Where there had been empty plains, there were now warriors. Dozens of them, mounted on painted war ponies, sitting silent and still, forming a perfect suffocating circle around her small cabin. They weren't shouting. They weren't brandishing their weapons. They didn't have to. Their presence was a weapon in itself, a silent promise of violence that pressed in on her from all sides. At their head was a man who seemed carved from the rock of the mountains themselves. He was older, his long braids streaked with silver, his face a road map of scars and sun. He sat on his horse with an unwavering stillness, his eyes fixed on her front door. This had to be Maka, Koa's father, the chief. Clara's hand went to her rifle, the cold steel of familiar comfort. Down below she could hear Koa shifting, a muffled groan of pain and fear. They were here for him, and he believed they were here to execute him. She took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped outside. The eyes of every warrior snapped to her. The silence was so profound, she could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. She held the rifle loosely at her side, not aiming it, but making sure they could all see it. "You've come for him," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The chief Maka dismounted with a fluid grace that defied his age. He walked toward her, his footsteps stirring up small puffs of dust. He stopped about 20 feet away, his hands empty and open at his sides. "We have come for our blood," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried an authority that needed no volume. "You're too late if you think you're going to kill him," Clara said, her chin held high. "He's under my protection." A murmur went through the assembled warriors. Maka's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed, studying her with an unnerving intensity. "You are a white woman," he said, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. "You protect one of your own, not one of us." "I protect a man who was left to die in the desert," she shot back. "A man who had an arrow in his leg. One of your arrows." That got a reaction. Maka's stoic facade cracked for just a second. Surprise flickered in his eyes. He glanced back at his warriors who were now whispering amongst themselves, their gazes shifting uneasily. "I found him," Clara pressed on, her confidence growing. "I pulled out the arrowhead. I cleaned the wound. I fought off the white men who wanted to scalp him. He is alive because of me, not because of you." From beneath the cabin, a floorboard creaked. Every head turned toward the sound. Maka's gaze was like a physical force. He knew. "He is in there," Maka stated. "He is," Clara confirmed. and he's not going anywhere until he's strong enough to walk on his own. Maka took another step closer. He was near enough now that she could see the intricate beadwork on his vest, the faded war paint on his cheekbones. The law of the tribe is absolute, he said, his voice low and dangerous. He broke that law. He ran from a sacred duty. The punishment is death. Clara's heart sank. Koa was telling the truth. What law? She demanded. What could he possibly have done to deserve to be hunted down by his own father? Maka's jaw clenched. That is not your concern. Give him to us now. The woman who shelters an enemy becomes an enemy herself. This was it, the moment of truth. She could hand Koa over, save herself, and go back to her lonely, quiet life. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as she looked at the hard, unforgiving face of the chief, she thought of the man in her cellar. The man who had looked at her not as a white woman, but as a person. The man whose life was now, inexplicably, tied to her own. No, she said, her voice ringing with a finality that surprised even herself. She raised the rifle, not aiming it at Maka, but holding it across her chest, a clear barrier. He is on my land. And on my land, my law is the only one that matters. You will not have him. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought Maka was going to signal an attack. She could see the fury in his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders. The warriors behind him shifted, their hands moving to their rifles and tomahawks. The air crackled with tension, so thick she could barely breathe. Then Maka did something she never expected. He raised a hand not to attack, but to halt his men. He looked at Clara, a long, searching look. It felt as if he was peering directly into her soul, weighing her, judging her. You are brave, and he said, the words seeming to be pulled from him against his will. Or you are a fool. Maybe I'm a little bit of both, she replied. He stared at her for another long moment, then gave a sharp, curt nod. He stays. For now. We will wait. We will see if the life you have saved is one worth saving. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and gave a signal to his men. But they didn't ride away. They dismounted. They began to set up a camp, their movements efficient and practiced. They were not leaving. They were settling in for a siege. Clara watched them, her stomach churning. She hadn't won anything. She had only delayed the inevitable. She was now a prisoner in her own home, trapped between two worlds with a circle of silent, waiting warriors, ensuring that she, and the man in her cellar, had nowhere left to run. And as the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the land, she realized the terrible truth. Tucker and his men were still out there somewhere. They would be back. And when they came, they wouldn't just be facing her. They'd be facing an entire Comanche war party, a war party that wasn't there to help her. They were there to reclaim a fugitive, and they would cut down anyone who stood in their way, including her. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, a quiet, nerve-shredding torment. The Comanche warriors were a constant presence, silent sentinels ringing her property. They never approached, never spoke to her, but their eyes were always on the cabin, always watching, waiting. Inside, the cabin felt more like a cage than a home. Clara spent her time tending to Koa, who was slowly but surely regaining his strength. He was able to sit up now, and with her help, he could stand for a few moments, leaning heavily on the cellar wall. He told her his story in fragmented pieces, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and shame. He had been betrothed to a woman named Nokomi, a marriage arranged by his father to unite their clan with another. But his heart belonged to someone else, a woman his father deemed unworthy. He refused the marriage, defying a tradition that had stood for generations. My father called it a betrayal of my duty, Koa said, his gaze distant. He said I had shamed our ancestors. He gave me a choice: marry Nokomi or be cast out as a traitor. So you ran, Clara whispered. He nodded. I chose freedom, but my father's honor is a hard thing. He sent my cousin, Tarak, and a dozen warriors to bring me back. He gave them an order. If I would not return, I was to be treated as an enemy of the people. Tarak, Clara said, the name feeling sharp on her tongue. He's the one who shot you? He did not want to. Koa said, a flicker of pain in his eyes. But he follows my father's word as if it were the word of the Great Spirit himself. He shot me in the leg to slow me, to bring me down. But I escaped. I thought I had lost them in the canyons. The story settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Koa wasn't a criminal. He was a man who had chosen love over duty, and now his own family wanted him dead, and she was caught in the middle of it. Every morning, Maka would appear at the edge of the woods, standing motionless, his gaze fixed on her cabin. It was a silent question. Is he ready? And every morning, Clara would step out onto her porch and shake her head, a silent answer. Not yet. It was a standoff, a battle of wills played out in silence and gestures. But their fragile, tense peace was about to be shattered. On the fourth day, the dusk came. Clara saw it first, a faint plume on the horizon, growing larger, more defined. It wasn't the Comanche. They were already here. It was riders, many of them, and they were coming fast. Tucker, she breathed, her blood turning to ice. She ran inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. Koa was at the top of the cellar stairs, his face pale but his eyes determined. He had seen the dust cloud too. They have come back, he said. Get back down, she ordered, grabbing her rifle from the wall. Stay hidden. No, he said, his voice surprisingly strong. He pulled himself up the last step, leaning heavily on the doorframe. He held out his hand. Give me a weapon. I will not hide while you fight for me. She hesitated for only a second. She looked into his eyes and saw the same fire she'd seen when she first found him. He would not let her face this alone. She grabbed an old hunting knife from a sheath on the wall and pressed it into his hand. She stepped outside just as Tucker and his posse thundered into her yard. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen men, their faces flushed with whiskey and rage. They looked like a pack of starving wolves who had finally cornered their prey. Had enough of playing house with your pet Indian, Clara? Tucker snarled, his eyes sweeping over her property with a possessive glare. We're here to finish what we started. But before Clara could even raise her rifle, a new sound cut through the air, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from the trees themselves. It grew louder, more powerful, a chorus of deep, resonant voices that vibrated in her chest. From the woods, the Comanche warriors emerged. They didn't rush. They walked slowly, deliberately, fanning out to form a line between the cabin and Tucker's men. At their center was Maka, his face like stone, his eyes burning with a cold, ancient fury. Tucker and his men reined in their horses, their confident smirks vanishing, replaced by looks of shock and fear. They had come expecting to fight one woman. They had not come expecting to face the entire Comanche nation. The air grew thick with a tension so powerful it was almost a physical thing. Two armies poised on the brink of a war, with Clara and her tiny cabin caught directly in the crossfire. Maka raised his hand, and the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. This is our land, Maka said, his voice carrying across the yard, each word sharp and clear. This is our business. You are not welcome here. Leave now, or be buried here. Tucker, for all his bluster, seemed to shrink in his saddle. He looked from the silent, painted faces of the warriors to the lone woman standing on the porch, and then back again. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and he knew it. But then one of his men, a young, nervous-looking boy, let his fear get the better of him. His hand twitched. His finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. There was a deafening crack. A puff of smoke erupted from the boy's rifle, and in the dirt, just inches from Maka's feet, a bullet kicked up a small cloud of dust. For a single frozen moment, the world held its breath. Then all hell broke loose. The Comanche warriors let out a unified, blood-curdling war cry that tore through the silence. It wasn't a sound of anger or fear. It was a sound of release, of unleashed power. They moved as one, a wave of arrows and bullets and flashing steel. Tucker's men, panicked and disorganized, returned fire wildly. The yard erupted into a chaotic storm of gunsmoke, shouting and the terrified screaming of horses. Clara dropped to the porch, pulling Koa down with her as bullets splintered the wood around them. This was it. The war had come to her doorstep. She peered over the edge of the porch and saw Maka moving through the chaos with a deadly calm, a tomahawk in one hand and a knife in the other. He was not a chief giving orders. He was a warrior in his element. But then she saw something that made her heart stop. Tarek, Koa's cousin, the one who had shot him, wasn't fighting the settlers. He had broken away from the main battle, and he was running, low and fast, not towards Tucker's men, but towards the back of her cabin, towards the unprotected cellar entrance. He wasn't fighting the posse. He was using the chaos of the battle as a cover to get to Koa and finish the job his chief had ordered him to do. Koa saw it too. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, the knife clutched tight in his hand. "He's come for me," Koa gasped, his eyes locked on his cousin. Clara didn't think. She acted. She grabbed her rifle, scrambled off the porch, and ran. She ran straight into the heart of the battle, ignoring the bullets whizzing past her head, the chaos exploding all around her. Her only thought was to get to Koa, to get between him and the man who was sent to kill him. She wasn't just sheltering a fugitive anymore. She wasn't just a woman caught in the middle. She had picked a side. And as she ran, she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that no matter who won this battle, her old life was over. It was being burned to the ground, right here, right now, in a storm of blood and gunpowder. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and sound. Gunsmoke burned her eyes. The roar of rifles was a physical blow against her ears. A riderless horse galloped past, eyes wide with terror. She saw one of Tucker's men go down, an arrow sprouting from his chest. The fight was brutal, chaotic, and happening all around her. But Clara only had eyes for one thing: Tarek. He was moving with the deadly grace of a panther, weaving through the gunfire, his focus absolute. He was almost to the back of the cabin. Koa was trying to intercept him, hobbling on his wounded leg, his face a mask of pained determination. He wouldn't make it in time. Clara raised her rifle, found Tarek in her sights, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt just behind Tarek's heels. But it did the one thing she needed it to do. It made him stop. He spun around, his eyes finding hers, and the look on his face was one of pure, venomous shock. He couldn't believe it. A white woman firing at him, defending the very man he was honor-bound to kill. That moment of hesitation was all Koa needed. He launched himself forward, letting out a raw cry that was part pain and part fury, and tackled his cousin. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the dirt, knives flashing in the sunlight. Clara ran toward them, reloading as she moved. But before she could get there, a new threat emerged. Tucker, his face a grotesque mask of rage, broke from the main fight and charged directly at her, his pistol raised. "Traitorous bitch!" he screamed, his eyes wild. "You die first." She didn't have time to aim. She just turned, raised her rifle, and fired from the hip. The bullet caught Tucker in the shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard, his pistol flying from his grasp. She stood over him, panting, the rifle smoking in her hands. He stared up at her, his face a mixture of agony and disbelief. "Why?" he gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "He's one of them. He would have killed you." "You don't get it, do you, Tucker?" she said, her voice shaking but clear. "This was never about him being Comanche. This was about you being a bully. You saw someone you thought was weak, and you decided to crush them. You were wrong." Meanwhile, the fight between Koa and Tarek was reaching its brutal climax. They were both skilled fighters, but Koa was injured. Tarek had the upper hand, his knife slicing through the air, forcing Koa onto his back. Tarek straddled him, raising his blade for the final, killing blow. "For the honor of the tribe!" Tarek grunted, his arm tensed. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them both. It was Maka. The chief stood there, his face unreadable, his tomahawk dripping with blood. He had seen everything. He had seen the white woman shoot his own warrior to protect his son. He had seen her take down the leader of the settlers. He had seen his son, his condemned son, fight with the last of his strength to defend her. Tarek froze, his knife hovering in the air. "Father," he said, using the respectful term for his chief, "I am carrying out your order." Maka did not look at Tarek. He looked at Koa, his son, lying wounded and bleeding in the dust. Yet his eyes were still defiant, still burning with that unquenchable fire. The battle around them was dying down. The remaining settlers, leaderless and terrified, were fleeing into the plains. The Comanche warriors were closing in, forming a silent circle around their chief, their son, and the woman who had just turned the tide of the entire battle. "The order has changed," Maka said, his voice quiet, yet it carried the weight of thunder. He looked at Clara, who still had her rifle trained on the wounded Tucker. He saw the grit in her eyes, the blood on her sleeve where a stray bullet had grazed her arm, the defiant set of her jaw. He saw a warrior. "You fought for my son," Maka said to her. It was not a question. "I fought for a man who deserved to live," she replied, her voice catching in her throat. Maka turned his gaze back to Tarek, who was still kneeling over Koa, confusion and fury warring on his face. "My son chose his own path," Maka said, his voice growing stronger. "He defied my word. He shamed his ancestors. For that, he was condemned. But today he fought not for himself, but for another. He fought with honor." He then looked at Tarek and his eyes turned to ice. "And you? You used the chaos of a battle against our enemies to try and kill your own blood. You hid your dishonor behind my orders. You have no honor." Maka raised his hand. Two warriors stepped forward and hauled Tarek to his feet, disarming him. His face was a mask of disbelief. He had been following orders. How could this be happening? Maka walked over to where Koa lay. He knelt down, not as a chief, but as a father. He looked at the deep gash on Koa's arm, the exhaustion on his face. He reached out and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You have bled for this woman," Maka said. "You have fought for this land. You are no longer an outcast. You are my son again." He helped Koa to his feet. Koa leaned on his father, his eyes finding Clara's across the yard. In that one look, 1,000 words were spoken. Gratitude, respect, something more. Clara finally lowered her rifle. The battle was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Her cabin was riddled with bullet holes. Her yard was a battlefield. The white world she had belonged to would never accept her back. They would call her a traitor, an outcast, a savage. Tucker, groaning in the dust, would make sure of that. She was utterly and completely alone, or so she thought. Maka approached her, his warriors parting to let him through. He stopped in front of her, his expression still hard to read, but the cold fury was gone. "You have no home now," he said. It was a statement of fact. She looked at her battered cabin, at the splintered porch and shattered windows. "No," she whispered. "I guess I don't." "Your people will hunt you for what you did today," he continued. She knew he was right. She had defended the Comanche. She had shot Tucker. There was no going back. Then Maka said the words that would change her life forever. "So you will make your home with us. You have the heart of a Comanche warrior. You have earned your place. Ride with us, Clara McKee. Ride with my son." He turned and looked at Koa, who was now standing on his own, his gaze locked on Clara. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation, a future she had never imagined, born from the ashes of a life she could no longer live. She looked at the faces of the warriors surrounding her. They were no longer enemies. They were something else. She looked at Koa, the man she had saved, who had in turn saved her. And in the middle of the blood-soaked dirt, surrounded by the wreckage of her past, she made her choice. Leaving was easier than she thought it would be. There was nothing left for her there. The cabin was just a shell, haunted by the ghosts of a life that no longer fit. She took nothing with her but the rifle she carried, the clothes on her back, and a small worn photograph of her parents she kept tucked in her pocket. Everything else she left to the wind and the dust. They gave her a horse, a steady, calm-eyed mare that seemed to understand the turmoil in its new rider's heart. She rode beside Koa, who, despite his injuries, sat tall and proud in his saddle. His father, Maka, rode at the head of the column, leading them away from the scarred land, away from the world of settlers and fences and laws written on paper. They rode west, towards the setting sun, into a land that was vast and wild and free. The world changed around her. The flat, dusty plains gave way to rolling hills, deep canyons and towering pillars of red rock that scraped against the bright blue sky. It was a beautiful country, a hard country, a country that felt, in a strange way, like coming home. No one spoke much on that first day. The silence was not awkward or tense, but filled with a shared understanding. They had all been through a fire, and they had all emerged on the other side, changed. Clara found herself watching Koa, the way he moved with his horse as if they were one being, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, constantly watchful, constantly aware. That night they made camp in a hidden cove, sheltered by ancient, wind-carved rocks. A small fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The warriors spoke in low tones in their own language, but there was no hostility in their glances toward her. There was curiosity, yes, but there was also a newfound respect. She was the white woman who fought, the woman who had stood her ground. Koa came and sat beside her, handing her a piece of roasted rabbit on a stick. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked into the flames, watching them lick at the darkness. "I don't know what I am," she admitted. "I don't belong anywhere anymore." "You belong here," he said, his voice filled with a simple certainty. "You belong with us." He looked at her, his dark eyes serious in the firelight. "With me." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to say. The world had been turned upside down so fast she hadn't had time to even consider what this new life meant, what he meant to her. He must have seen the confusion on her face, because he didn't press her. He just sat with her in a comfortable silence, sharing his food, sharing the warmth of the fire. Later, as she lay wrapped in a thick buffalo robe, staring up at a blanket of stars more brilliant than any she had ever seen, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in years since her husband had died, she didn't feel lonely. She was surrounded by people, a new and strange people, but she was not alone. The days turned into weeks. She learned their ways. She learned to be quiet on the trail, to read the signs in the land, to find water where it seemed there was none. She learned a few words of their language, and they, in turn, were endlessly fascinated by her stories of the world she had left behind. Her bond with Koa grew deeper with each passing day. It was a bond forged not in soft words and gentle courtship, but in shared hardship and silent understanding. He taught her how to track, how to use a bow. She taught him how to read the words in an old book she had managed to save. They would sit by the fire at night, his shoulder brushing against hers, and it felt more real, more right than anything she had ever known. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, he took her to a high cliff overlooking a river that snaked through the canyon below. "This is a sacred place," he told her, "the place where the Sky Father first touched the Earth Mother." He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a necklace. It wasn't made of gold or silver, but of something far more precious. It was a string of polished stones, the color of the river, interspersed with small, intricately carved pieces of bone. At its center was a single eagle feather. "My mother made this for me before she died," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She said to give it only to the woman who held my heart, the woman who was my spirit's other half." He held it out to her. His hands were trembling slightly. "Clara McKee," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "You have the heart of a warrior and the spirit of a hawk. You are brave and strong and true. You saved my life, but you did more than that. You saved my soul." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "My heart is yours. Will you have it?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She thought of the lonely woman she had been, hauling water under a merciless sun, her life as dry and empty as the dust around her. And she looked at the man standing before her, a man who had been her enemy, her patient, her ally, and now her whole world. She didn't need to speak. She just nodded, a silent yes that held all the words her heart was too full to say. He smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit up his entire face. Gently, he placed the necklace around her neck. The stones were cool against her skin. It felt like a promise, a new beginning, a final binding tie to this new life, this new tribe. this new man. He didn't kiss her then. Instead, he took her hand, his strong fingers lacing through hers, and together they stood on the edge of the world and watched the sun go down. Two people from different worlds, forged into one by the fires of hatred, and bound together by a love that was as wild and untamable as the land itself. Their story wasn't an easy one. It was a story of blood and dust and choices that cost everything. But it was a real story, and it proves that sometimes the most beautiful things can grow in the hardest of places. If you believe that courage can change the world and that love is worth fighting for no matter the odds, then you're in the right place. Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we've got a lot more stories just like this one coming your way. You won't want to miss a single one.